I don't think we need any real introduction here for Dr. Igor Krupnik. He is one of perhaps the greatest cultural anthropologists of our time, as evidenced by the recent ISAC medal that he received, his work at the Smithsonian, his work in Russia, Alaska, and other countries. So without further ado, let me just ask you, I'll throw you a softball, is what did IPY do for Indigenous people?
Well, I want to remind you that when the IPY was in its initial stages, it was already planned as something with what then was called a human component or a human dimension. It's not like the fourth IPY as a concept was completely devoid of people or cultures, but it was viewed as something that would be some sort of, I won't call it marginal, but definitely at the bottom of the traditional list of gold science, which is of course geophysics and all kind of hard science. And it took a very dedicated effort by several people and groups, including indigenous groups and professional organizations of Arctic social scientists, who didn't have yet partners from the southern hemisphere to push through the door, that eventually the emerging IPY documents in 2004 and 2005 really included a substantial component on social sciences and made it a special sixth theme in IPY, which was very important. It also resulted in placing two social scientists, Greta Hovelsrud and myself, on the IPY Joint Committee for the first time in the history of IPYs, that social scientists were sitting at the table. Well, unfortunately, we didn't have indigenous people on the IPY Joint Committee, but we hope we'll do it in IPY 5 some 50 years down the road.
Okay, we saw the evidence here in Canada is that the Inuit, the Dene, were very much involved in a lot of work, and not just as subjects, but as partners in the research. And some pretty fascinating, intersections between indigenous ecological knowledge and scientific knowledge came into play. But did that happen in the circumpolar world? For example, the people in Chukotka, did they get the same kind of opportunity to participate?
Well, it's a good question, because IPY, as much as it has a kind of a common concept, was implemented by 60 nations. And each nation, including the nations that are, around the Arctic Circle, has its very different policy, and it's at a different stage in appreciating the role of indigenous people. I would certainly kind of praise what Canada and Greenland have done in putting indigenous people and cultural issues, social cultural issues in general, at the very top of their IPY lists. Not all other countries did this. On the other hand, IPY as an international initiative, and also we have to see IPY, this past IPY, in a very different context, because for the first time IPY was done not along the national silos as it used to be with the first three IPYs. There, or then, every nation was in charge of its program. And except for Antarctica, there was hardly any cross-boundary cooperation where scientists from other nations worked on other nations' territories. In IPY 4, this type of cooperation was sort of a mandatory thing. And for example, even if the Russian activities in IPY didn't cover Chukotka to the extent that was necessary, we had some projects, including the project that we have been doing, the SIKU, Sea Ice Knowledge and Use, which had a very strong Chukotka component. And there was another international project called MOVE on the it's called migrations of northern residents that were implemented and often forcefully by the states. It was an international project that was funded internationally and mostly through NSF and European Commission. And it covered the sides of the story that were never covered on the Russian side.
Well, let me just explore that a little bit. We could argue that the cultural divide between scientists and indigenous people has been narrowed as a result of IPY. But do you not get the sense, and I get it because I come from a journalism background, that we still stereotype a lot of the issues in Indigenous cultures from a mainstream media point of view?
Well, there is definitely a gap in perspectives. It's a gap in vocabulary, how people speak. It's definitely a gap in emotions, because something that for scientists is the place to work, for Indigenous people is the place to live. And you cannot have the same emotions when talking about the place you live, and particularly if your house is in trouble, like it is currently in many places in the Arctic. What we are learning and what we have learned in IPY is to communicate better and to understand not only the gap, but where we have made paths and bridges across that gap. For example, before IPY, that was in my today's talk this morning, we already started documenting Indigenous people's knowledge about climate change, which they already kind of have observed in their areas. But that was, in a way, a little bit kind of a one-way process. Normally, an anthropologist would come with a microphone and a tape recorder and put a tape recorder in front of a native elder or an expert and say, well, could you tell me something about climate change? And then it was like 30 minutes or 3 hours of stories about climate change, and that was duly recorded and provided a wealth of information. But it wasn't much of an interaction. It was recording what people know and a one-way kind of transmission of knowledge and data. And back in 2004 or 5, I identified it as a glass ceiling. It's something we have to break through, because this was definitely not enough for us to understand what's happening. We had to, at that time, explore, develop, introduce other methodologies, put more people, including Indigenous people and local people, put more people in more active watch and contribution to make it a two-way street, to make it a real partnership. And I believe we have achieved a substantial progress in IPY. Some people call it baby steps. Yeah, I agree, but we made them.
I can imagine some of the anthropology students that had to go out with the reindeer herders probably didn't think it were baby steps, but some pretty hard steps that were made along the way.
True.
I mean, is there a moment, a eureka moment for you in your long career where you moved out of that old paradigm of thought into the new paradigm of thought? Was there an experience that you had?
Well, I can tell you a funny story that happened to me personally. I was working on St. Lawrence Island. It's a big island of Alaska in the Bering Strait between Alaska and Russia. And I was doing a project on genealogies, histories, and oral tradition of local people. And it was 1999, early 2000, and a few people in the community said, Igor, you keep asking us all these stories about our grandparents. Have you seen that our life is changing, that there is climate change, that ice is not as it used to be? Could we talk about something which is more important than our grandfather's stories? And that was really a sort of an aha moment, oh yes, well, we probably have to focus on something that is more relevant to people's life. Now, the funny flip side of that very story, that this past fall, I came across the same people after I spent 12 years in the trenches documenting climate change, and they said to me, Igor, well, you're coming so often and you keep talking about the climate change. Can we probably get back to our grandfather's stories? So that was maybe the end of the cycle. So we have to get back to grandfather's stories.
That's a great story. Well, thank you very much for coming. I really enjoyed it, and the crowd did as well. Thanks.